wanted to talk about tonight. And as Kokai said last week, when Nut asks you to do something, there's no other answer but yes. You cannot say no to Nut. And one of the things that's so wonderful about that, especially now, is that this Sangha and this space and all you people are very safe and sacred. And I just know that we have this unconditional positive regard for one another that makes it possible to think about these sometimes challenging ideals that we've set for ourselves, but to make it seem possible because we see each other doing it. So I thank you all so much for your example and for being here and supporting me and supporting everyone. It's also interesting that Eric mentioned earlier in his comments being struck by the notion of the importance of compassion and loving kindness for others, because that is what I wanted to talk about tonight. We are just 11 days into 2024. So oftentimes with a new year comes a lot of grandiose plans. New year, new you. I didn't make a resolution last year, but I'm going to this year. I made a resolution last year and I quit it after 3 days. So sometimes this can be a little bit of a challenge because we can set ourselves up for failure with these notions, and it can be a little bit tricky. But for us, we have the benefit of already being engaged in practice. And what does practice do? It makes progress. So we can rest a little easier in knowing that if we are practicing, we are making progress. I would like to challenge us all to consider focusing in on one particular spoke of the dharmic wheel, which is compassion. And as we've said already tonight, as Laurie so beautifully stated, we have to give compassion to ourselves. As RuPaul says at the end of every episode of Drag Race, if you can't love yourself, how in the hell are you going to love somebody else? So that's fundamental. That's foundational. We have to give love to ourselves. But hopefully we're on this path far enough along that we can consider really extending that compassion to others in a meaningful way. And I think this year it's going to be really hard because we're facing a year of geopolitical, climatological, every kind of turmoil you can imagine. And those tensions that exist in the world impact us greatly because we see people suffering needlessly. We see people being subject to the worst kinds of deprivation and degradation for reasons that seem nonsensical to us, and that we have a visceral, sometimes violent response to, perhaps not physically, but definitely emotionally. And this is where I think compassion can really serve us to help tamp down those feelings of anger, but it can also serve our wider world, so that rather than reacting with outrage and perhaps righteous indignation, we're able to react with compassion and the notion that whoever is inflicting this harm wants and needs the same things that we do. A commitment to compassion can help ease our own fear and anger, feelings that flare up during hard times. And when our own fear and anger are eased, it creates more of an atmosphere of calm and serenity that can impact others. It might seem impossible, but we all know that what seems impossible may be achieved because of the practice. So that's seemed a little heavy. I apologize. We're going to take a slight detour into maybe something a little more easily digested. And this is another great story from the Buddha, who, of course, is the reason why we're here and always has a great story for us to guide us along the way. So many of you may not have heard about cow releasing. I don't know that there's anybody among us who actually owns a cow, but we probably see cows all the time and we benefit from them greatly. But there was a time when many people owned cows, and in the Buddha's day, this was the case. So one day the Buddha was sitting with his monks in the woods, and they had just finished their mindful lunch and were about to start a question and answer session. A peasant passed by and asked the Buddha, "Dear monk, have you seen my cows passing by here?" The Buddha said, "What cows?" The farmer answered, "My cows, 6 of them. I don't know why, but this morning they all ran away. I also cultivated 3 acres of sesame seeds, but this year the insects ate them all. I have lost everything. I might as well be dead." The Buddha said, "Dear friend, we have not seen your cows passing by here. You better look for them in the other direction." After the farmer had gone, the Buddha looked at his monks and smiled and said, "My dear friends, do you know that you are lucky? You do not have any cows to lose." And so we're very much like the monks in that we don't have cows to lose, but we do have our own cows, things that seem sacred to us and impossible to do without. We think that these things are crucial to our happiness and to our safety. But if you look deeply, you might see that what we possess are obstacles for our happiness. If you can let them go and release your cows, happiness becomes more possible. Something you might consider doing in the coming days is to actually write down the names of your own cows on a piece of paper so that you can take a look at them and think about them and think about how they impact your own happiness as well as your relationship with others. One of my cows is judgment. I'm very good at passing judgment. I do it all the time. I should be called Judge Judy. I'm so good at it. So I have to make a very intentional stoppage to myself to say, okay, I'm going down this path and I need to stop it. Because it's very interesting when you examine yourself and your cow, I think you're going to find that it's not really that great. It's not really that great to be a judge, passing judgment on everyone. It doesn't make me feel better. It doesn't help the other person. And it just sows illness. A cow might be a job, a relationship, a position, or an ideology. And I think this is one of the things that we're really faced with this year. we also sometimes think that we can't live without our doctrines or our ideologies. And we can become very upset and angered when other people are trying to promote their own ideologies. And we live in a world where people are great at it. We're currently in a situation where thousands of people are dying every day because of ideology. I live in a state where we're coming on the anniversary of 6 people being killed in a school, and people's ideologies don't want to stop that from happening. And it's so challenging to come face to face with someone else who has a cow that is as dear to them as my cow is to me. And they don't want to let go of their cow, just like I don't want to let go of my cow. I think it's so important. I'm deathly afraid of what will happen if I lose my cow. If I don't have that cow, what will become of me? Holding on to these notions of things that are so important, our sacred cows, causes us suffering. If you can release your cow, you may be able to become unstuck and realize the full potentiality of existence. You may even just for a moment be able to reach enlightenment. True happiness can only exist in the absence of fear. When we continue to hold on to things that are there because of our fear, it's going to prevent us from achieving our highest expression of ourselves, of joy, of peace. Conversely, when our minds are free from anger, fear, and jealousy, we can be serene, calm, and concentrated. And this is where we can have a great entry point to compassion for others. When we think about others, maybe we react immediately to hearing about someone. We react with anger. But if we can take a moment to pause and think, what are their cows? What may be causing them to act in this way? It can be the start of having compassion. Anytime we produce even a single thought of compassion, of understanding, of non-judgment, of forgiveness, it puts us on the same frequency as the Buddha and the Bodhisattvas. The Buddha can then shine within you, creating an ocean of good energy that brings healing and nourishment. Developing compassion helps us become more in tune with Buddha energy. And the more of us that are regularly practicing compassion and creating this energy won't be able to help but see the ripple effects and the waves that it will have. Just like some of the big waves that have been crashing in Santa Cruz lately, just imagine if those were waves of compassion. The compassion that we feel for each other in this group, imagine if we could somehow communicate that to others. Compassion helps us to manage our everyday lives more gracefully. Another cow for, it's not as much for me now because I don't drive as much as I used to, but I think many of us would probably agree that driving can be a big cow. Do not turn in front of me. We can become so irate and angered by driving a car. It's kind of ridiculous when you think about it. Here we are in this, I mean, for me, I'm in a Prius, so it's basically a tin can. And, I'm acting like I'm the biggest thing on the road and everyone needs to stand aside for me. And I mean, what if that person heard what I was saying about them in my car because they didn't go quite as fast as I wanted them to? horrible. And then, of course, consider if I can recollect myself, what is that person doing? What are they going to? They almost certainly have just as important a destination as I have, and may not have near the tools that I have to handle whatever it is they're faced with. These small moments throughout our days can help build our capacity for compassion in the really large moments that we face. Every situation is an opportunity to practice and a chance to begin again. So often we talk about the notion of cultivating compassion, and that's because compassion doesn't just spring from our hearts the moment we decide to follow a spiritual path. It's something that has to be tended and given thought and given intention and given commitment. But every moment we do it, we're making progress to becoming better and better. Once we can start cultivating compassion, we can work on some of those trickier things, like in non-hatred. Hatred seems like such a strong, and it is an ugly word, but when we treat someone as less than ourselves, that's what we're doing. We're hating another person. We're making that harsh judgment against them without maybe even knowing any of their circumstances. Compassion puts us further on the path to being loving and kind to all. One of the opportunities that we have to develop this trait is part of the Eightfold Path, and that's right speech. Of course, I highlight that because that's a big one for me. That's something I'm so often thinking about. What's a worse feeling than regretting something you have said in anger or judgment or even just irritation? It's a little bit funny maybe to look to Jane Austen as a source of Buddhist inspiration, but one of my favorite Jane Austen novels is Emma. And if you're not familiar with that story, it's about a young woman who has every advantage in life. She's perfectly positioned in every way. But she has a moment where she gets a little irritated with someone, and she's in a large gathering, and she uses her heightened position to take someone else down. And she expected to be maybe not praised for it, but certainly not chastised for it. But everyone present knew that what she said and did was wrong. And it was a real moment for this character to come face to face with some of the worst aspects of her nature. Thankfully, she had supportive friends there to guide her into a better way of being. And she took it upon herself to make amends for what she had done. But it's such a perfect example of how saying something, even if it's witty or clever at the expense of someone else, helps no one, not even ourselves. So there are a few tools actually that I like to use, and I'll just share with you all that this is one of the books that started me, helped me along on my journey. It's Easier Than You Think, The Buddhist Way to Happiness by Sylvia Boorstein. And a couple of the suggestions she has are, before we speak or say something, to take a moment to contemplate, is what I'm saying an improvement over saying nothing? So again, for myself, when I'm especially in a work situation, it's real easy to start talking about, oh, can you believe she did that? Oh, it's just so ridiculous. This is a situation I have regretted so many times engaging in. So if we can just take a moment to think, is this going to be helpful to anyone? We can just say nothing. It might be a little uncomfortable for the other person, but because we're acting out of compassion, even for someone who may be speaking ill in that moment, they're not going to feel uncomfortable. It's going to be okay. We don't have to engage in that same kind of speech just to make someone else feel better. They'll feel better when you're still interacting with them because of your compassion for them and the other person involved. There's another rule she talks about in this book, and I don't know, I've never heard anybody else say this. I've only read it in this book, but it's the 60-second rule of answering. So the suggestion is that when you're in conversation with someone and someone asks you a question or you're called upon to comment, you take 60 seconds before you speak to really consider your response. Now, 60 seconds may seem like a short time when we're just sitting here chatting. Right now, it may seem to y'all like a long time because I'm taking a lot of 60 seconds. And it kind of is a long time for there just to be silence, especially if the other person doesn't know that you're obeying the 60-second rule. That's probably not going to work too well, but you could maybe consider taking 6 seconds to respond to someone. You could consider even letting someone know, I need to think about that for a literal minute or for a few seconds before I respond to you. You could even let the other person know if they're not accustomed to this type of interaction. I'm going to give this some thought before I answer you. So let's just sit for a moment. There are so many opportunities for us to engage with others in compassion that don't necessarily involve sweeping an action under the rug or being uh, really particularly, spiritual. Oh, I'm going to give you the chance to speak, or I'm going to wait to speak. It doesn't have to be like that. It can just be very simple, a matter of degrees. Of course, we can also work on our own cows and becoming less afraid to release our cows. Anytime we're less frightened, we can be more graceful. Anytime we can be less angry, we can be more loving. So we can think less is more. Less of the bad things, more of the good things that we all want. Another tool we can use to think about other people is to appreciate the ways they may be fearful. Many people have been through all kinds of events in their lives that are traumatic. And too often, we don't even consider that when we're thinking about someone, especially if it's a fleeting interaction. The person in the car that cut me off, I'm not thinking about what all they're going through. I'm just irritated with them in that moment. But especially when it's with someone we're seeing regularly or even on a broader scale, someone that's in the public eye, we really should consider that person. What has their life been? What are they frightened of? What is causing them to act in such fear and anger? We can have sorrow for that person. What the thing that has happened to them that has caused them to develop these buttons of protection. We can think to ourselves, similarly to Laurie's metta meditation, I'm so sorry these things have frightened you to create these responses in you. Just like we know our minds are essentially peaceful because we all have Buddha nature. So do the people that are holding on to their cows filled with Buddha nature. The person who seems to be so irrational and illogical, even in doing something horrible on a grand scale, that person is the Buddha. That person is part of us. We are the same. We want and need the same things, which is safety, security, and peace. So I will leave us with thinking about the 4 divine abodes, which is another part of Buddhism. And it's really funny to me to be talking about these to y'all because so many of you are so much more learned than I am. Like, I've just been lucky to read a couple of books to find this, but the 4 divine abodes are this lovely notion of resting. Your abode is where you rest, and they are loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. So loving kindness is this spontaneous response to others, this sense of having metta for all, for everyone. Compassion is a response to the pain that others have suffered, and the recognition that every pain is important to the person who has suffered it. Sympathetic joy is a shared delight in the good fortune of others. And it's something that can really help you to see another person with the eyes of happiness and joy and being glad to see them. Even if you're really not, you can rejoice in another's triumphs. It helps build that muscle of compassion. And finally, equanimity, holding all things in balance. This gives us a little bit of an out, perhaps, because on the one hand, we're going to be compassionate and have loving kindness for all, but we also have to recognize that sometimes we may not be able to engage fully with someone who is still driving their cows to destruction. When we can ourselves be equanimous, we can have more ease about our daily lives, which is going to transfer to every encounter we have with other people. And Laurie ended our meditation with the metta for everyone. And that's another lesson from Sylvia Boorstein. She recounted a story where she was on an airplane flight and she was deathly afraid. There was a lot of turbulence. She really thought she was going to die. And so she started doing metta. And so when she's going through her list, it got to be too much. There were too many names. So she just said, may all beings be happy. May all beings be at ease. And it struck her that that was the easiest thing to do than trying to remember everyone's name. It's really easy if we can try and love everyone. The last thing I'm going to do, I know I said I was going to end with that, but I'm not. I have one more thing, goodie for y'all. So it's another book. This is the spiritual book I'm reading right now, The Force of Kindness by Sharon Salzberg, another great teacher. Change your life with love and compassion. And it's a really beautiful poem. The name of the poem is actually Kindness, and the author is Naomi Shihab Nye. Kindness. Before you know what kindness really is, you must lose things. Feel the future dissolve in a moment, like salt in a weakened broth. What you held in your hand, what you counted and carefully saved, all this must go, so you know how desolate the landscape can be between the regions of kindness. How you ride and ride, thinking the bus will never stop. The passengers eating maize and chicken will stare out of the window forever. Before you learn the tender gravity of kindness, you must travel where the Indian in a white poncho lies dead by the side of the road. You must see how this could be you, how he too was someone who journeyed through the night with plans and the simple breath that kept him alive. Before you know kindness as the deepest thing inside, you must know sorrow as the other deepest thing. You must wake up with sorrow. You must speak to it till your voice catches the thread of all sorrows and you see the sides of the cloth. Then it is only kindness that makes sense anymore. Only kindness that ties your shoes and sends you out into the day to mail letters and purchase bread. Only kindness that raises its head from the crowd of the world to say, "It is I you have been looking for," and then goes with you everywhere, like a shadow or a friend.